thank you for coming. There are people from all over the world really here. I'm really glad to see a lot of my friends, a lot of my colleagues, and a lot of people that actually made the book and the research contained in this book possible. Because as much as I am the author of this book, the content of the book is really based upon some of the research I had the luxury to conduct at UVM Medical Center, especially in the inpatient psychiatry unit. So before I start with the description of what the book is about, I would like to say thank you to the following let's see. Yes, please try on and off again. Here you go. So I would like to say thank you to the Burlington Book Festival, to the University of Vermont Medical Center, the Larner College of Medicine, the College of Nursing and Health Sciences, the Department of Leadership and Developmental Sciences, CCV, the College of Vermont, University of Sofia, Kliment, Ohridski, the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, and my publisher, Ibidem Verlag in Germany, and Columbia University Press. So, medical philosophy. This is a textbook that tries to combine theoretical approaches in medicine and the analysis of the scientific method. However, the most important area we will focus here is psychiatry and psychology, not just because that's my primary affiliation, but because I thought that by analyzing the issues and the structure of medical practice in psychiatry, we will have the wonderful opportunity to better understand what it means to be a patient, but first of all, what it means to be a person. And patient-centered medicine is actually what we're trying to focus on in our everyday practice. I would like also to thank all the staff at the inpatient psychiatry unit that made this research possible. I saw a lot of you here, so thank you for coming. And I also would like to define what the issue at hand here is. So this is something that I thought when I was trying to come up with a cover for the book, which is a question mark and a stethoscope, thanks to Sonia right there. And it's this combination between the question we're trying to ask and what this question means in terms of medical practice. So since this is a book about philosophy, it's about psychology, we have to start from the table of content. So here is the content of the book. So in the first chapter, we covered a brief history of medical philosophy, and already we should make a distinction here. This is a book on medical philosophy and not philosophy of medicine, which it's not just a nice way to complicate things because philosophers oftentimes like their sound of their voice, but it's simply to define the question. So if in philosophy of medicine the analysis is on the that or on the what, in medical philosophy the analysis is on the how. So in other words, instead of just focusing on a statistical analysis of the scientific method, we focus on the person with its complexity and its multi-layered essence. So in the first chapter we cover the history and the connection of medicine with art, science, and technology. In the last part, self-image, academic achievement, and healing process. So I would like to think of medicine as defined by these three elements, and it's not something that I came up with. I cannot claim to define art in this sense. It's actually coming from Aristotelian philosophy. So Aristotle was the first one that defined science in a threefold way. So science as techne, which was actually the technique and technology, so the ability to convey data based on scientific evaluation, and science as an art, so medicine especially definitely fits into this category, and finally science as episteme and phronesis. Episteme would be pretty much equivalent of science the way it's understood in English, while phronesis contains a more ethical aspect. So we do science not only to ameliorate the general outlook on what we don't know yet, but we do science also to improve our sense of self in connection to others. And in medicine, especially in psychiatry, a field in which there are a lot of things left unspoken, untold, because we can only base our analysis on the symptomatology of the patient based on what we observe, art and phrenology, it's really, really important. I will not read the whole table of content, not to bore you already, but there are 7 chapters, and each chapter focuses on one specific way to look at the problem. Okay, so in the first 3 chapters, you have kind of the brief history. This second part is hermeneutics and evidence-based medicine, and chapter 3 is neuroscience and phenomenology. Now, this is not a lecture on either philosophy or neuroscience, and I'm not assuming that those terms might be familiar to all of you. The first term, hermeneutics, is actually intended a further analysis or interpretation of the text, and it's often used for texts that have to do with either sacred content, biblical sources, exegetic sources, etc. Versus for phenomenology, the term defines a philosophical approach that was first discussed in depth by Hegel and then Heidegger. For chapter 4, again, the patient at the center of therapy. Chapter 5, complementary, alternative, and traditional medicine. Chapter 6, beyond the realm of this world, which is not a title for a Hollywood movie, but it's really the introduction to the research, the clinical research conducted on a unit. And the research was actually part of our attempt to better understand the patient from the perspective of his or her own belief system, which we will see in a second. The third part is translational science, which is a very fancy term to simply define what information we gather by the application of the scientific method in the laboratory to the application to the everyday life. So we do science not because we feel good about doing science, or part, it's true. We do science to improve our lives. Okay? So this is pretty much the content. The last part, the appendix, is the empirical research conducted at UVM. So we have to start from the brain, and the reason why I chose this image is because I am a strong supporter of doing things by hand, and I love calligraphy and I love drawing things, and I say because it feels good, I feel it's also the best way to memorize things. And I do that with my students as well. So here comes my wife, welcome. Dobrodošla. And my little one. So, hi Adrian. So we are focusing on the brain here because the biggest assumption we have in psychiatry is that there is such thing as a separation between mind and brain. And this is a philosophical assumption that makes sense only if you already discuss the possible outcomes of either a materialistic, nihilistic orientation or a monistic orientation. So why do we think that we have 2 different aspects of our personality? On one side you have the body, the physical mechanism, the processes in the brain, and the other part is something that's really hard to define depending on what your system belief might be. Either mind in a sense of psychological processes, or soul even, or self. And as much as there is really no way to scientifically demonstrate the existence of the second part by science intended as the scientific method and the primacy of observation and the principle of falsifiability, nevertheless, if you want to talk to a patient, whether in a form of psychotherapy or as a nurse, as a group therapist, as a psychiatrist, etc., the assumption is that this patient has a sense of self that he or she can use to change their outlook in life. On the other side, however, if there is no such thing as a self or as a mind, and this is just a social or cultural construct, then we would not be very honest to our patients, in the sense that we are claiming that we can change things, but if those changes cannot happen due to the fact that there's only a material brain, then it's really hard to defend this position. So one of the reasons why I decided to write a book on medical philosophy is because I wanted to be honest with my patients, pretty much. And I also wanted to try to reconnect to the deepest level of their understanding. And we do this quite often on a unit, and the group therapists that are present here tonight will tell you that we really cover a lot of different approaches on our unit, from classical psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, executive behavioral therapy, all the way to meditation, mindfulness, Tai Chi, etc. So we're trying to present a picture of a person that goes far beyond what is usually intended with classical psychotherapy. So those are just the main areas of the brain, so I will not try to be too tedious and bore you with the discussion of brain structure, but real quick, in neuroscience we usually subdivide the brain into areas based on what each of these areas does to the brain. So real quick, you have 4 lobes. You have the frontal lobe right there, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe, and each of these lobes are responsible for specific mechanism in the brain. Now, without digging too deep in the processes beyond these lobes, the question here is it honest to assume that there is such thing as a constant self, and this self is to some extent influenced by the external environment, and in turn this external environment determines how the self changes, and therefore the self will change and will change its perception of this environment? Is the old nature versus nurture type of debate. How much we have, how much knowledge do we have of who we are, and how much our sense of self changes constantly. Now, from the perspective of neuroscience, this is nothing new. We all know that each day our cell pretty much rebuild themselves. Cell die and cell regrow pretty much on a daily basis. However, until fairly recent times, we didn't know that the same was applicable to the brain as well. And even if you're not a psychotherapist or neuroscientist, you know that there are issues such as Alzheimer's, for instance, Parkinson's disease, that we can target, but we can't completely solve, at least not yet. So there seems to be quite evidence for the fact that, unfortunately, if you lose part of your neurological activity and your neurons die, there doesn't seem to be enough evidence that you can recover from that. However, most recent research actually clearly indicated, which never said that research shows or proves, but at least indicated that the same thing happens on a neurological level, and that's the field of neuroplasticity, so the ability of the brain to regrow itself, at least in terms of pattern. And this is really at the center of our discussion here. So, in this book, we try to cover those approaches that take as a philosophical assumption the fact that we do have a mind as a separated entity from the brain. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the approaches that are discussed in the book. So, part of my job at Ibidem is also doing research in the field of integrative health, and this is in itself a quite controversial term, and I want to spend some time discussing that because we live in a quite interesting, if not scary time in our country, in which science is sometimes viewed as a conspiracy theory. So when we talk about integrative approaches, I want to make sure that we still are embracing our scientific method fully. And we have to start from the definition. So integrative approaches are pretty much the same as complementary approaches, okay? In some cases, even alternative approaches. And there is a department of the National Institute of Health that actually dedicates a huge part of its research to these approaches. So the reason why we use nowadays the term integrative medicine and integrative health is because we want to make sure that we are integrating the scientific method used in medicine. We are not attempting to substitute our approaches to medicine, okay, intended in a scientific sense. Because if you think about, if something is complementary, it means that what you're trying to complement is not enough. So you're trying to add something that will solve that problem. We're not claiming that medicine is not good enough. On the contrary. And the same thing happens for alternative medicine, okay? By alternative medicine, we don't mean something that's alternative to something that has been disregarded in the scientific term. We simply mean something that should go deeper, and that's what we're trying to do here. Obviously, this has a lot to do with the current political discourse. We have to think of being politically correct, but at the same time being scientifically accurate in that sense. So those are some of the approaches that are discussed in the book, and the discussion of the book is really not about the techniques. Okay, there are a lot of very good resources out there. So in my book here, I simply want to provide enough evidence in terms of what research studies have been conducted on each of these fields. Okay, so the assumption here is nothing should be taken for granted until you have some sort of evidence. Okay, and we will return to this term in a little bit. So I will not read them all aloud, but there are some of these approaches that we use even in psychiatry, such as guided imagery, for instance. And there are other approaches, such as anthroposophic medicine, for instance, that are implementing what has already been done in classical medicine. Anthroposophic medicine, it's a sub-medical field developed by Rudolf Steiner, and it's part of the Waldorf school and biokinetics type of environment. And I also wanted to point out that it's sometimes very difficult not to put a lot of different things in the same basket. Okay? And that's why I included Christian faith healing, religious spiritual healing, and shamanism there. Obviously, those are not the same thing. And from the perspective of current science, the way we interpret science, the first one, Christian faith healing, as defined by that, is unfortunately not as backed up by science as in the case of certain areas of religious spiritual healing. Okay, we'll discuss that a little more in depth. Ethnomedicine and folk medicine and traditional medicine. Something I want to mention here is that as much as science should be at the center of our discourse here, the assumption that science is something that's completely detached from ourselves or completely objective, it's also a misnomer. So in other words, every type of medicine and every type of psychology, it's a folk medicine, a folk psychology, in a sense that it's culturally embedded in the here and the now. Okay, so I want to give you a few examples. In the notes we need to write after a group on the unit, one of the things we will write, for instance, is how the patient behaved in terms of how much the behavior could be standardized in a sense of being considered quote-unquote normal. And one of the best example would be the focus, the attentiveness, the affect, and all those things are, as much as they're observable, because you are doing the group, so you observe the patient, they're still pretty much embedded in the way we feel about the patient. So for instance, how am I to define a patient's personality based on how much does this person look at me in the eye? Those are very much culturally related issues. Okay. The other thing, something like boundaries. We really try to do our best on our unit to define what boundaries are, and in different cultures, boundaries are considered different depending on what your personal space might be. And I'm being Italian, my personal space is probably the size of this book, so I really have a lot to learn. But thanks to my colleague, I think I got it at this point. And we continue with the second part of Integrative Approaches, again, herbal medicine, phytotherapy, spagyrics, all the way to meditation, mindfulness, mind-body medicine, narrative medicine. Again, mind-body medicine is, again, based on this philosophical assumption that are two different things, right? Because otherwise, why would you need to connect something that doesn't need to be connected other than one thing, right? And in this sense, I would like to briefly discuss what the main philosophical assumptions in the history of philosophy are in regard to medicine. So on one side, you have a monistic perspective. So monos is Greek for one, so just one perspective, okay? And you could have two different types of monism. On one side, you have a natural monism. By nature, we intend the body, the physical aspect. So the extreme view in this area would be simply there's no such thing as, a mind that is separated from the body, okay? Everything is one and everything is the body. So sure, you can talk about the soul, you can talk about the mind, but in the end, we're just our neurological transmitted information. That's one way of monism. On the other side, monism could be, well, whatever we define as matter, as body, really defines the way we create this definition. So it's kind of a catch-22 here, because the assumption is that you only have a brain, you are your brain, and you're using your brain to define whether you have a brain or not. So this is the monistic part, okay? And again, I'm not trying to make fun of monism. It's a very, very important part of philosophy, especially of analytic philosophy. But it's not the only monism we have. Some philosophers see monism in a more extreme way, and some philosophers see it in a more, balanced, if you want, or imprecise, depending on whom you ask. So you can have the primacy of the mind or the primacy of the body, okay? And you're kind of halfway between monism and dualism. Duo is Latin for two, right? So two different things, mind on one side, body on the other. But at this point, you have to decide for yourself which one is more important. So is it the mind that controls the body? Is the mind that controls our physical processes? Or, as Adrian would say, my son, no, it's actually the opposite. It's actually the brain that controls the mind. It's the body that controls our feelings and thoughts. Now, it's not just a philosophical consideration for, experts in philosophy. It really impacts our everyday life. And I want to, give you an example. If we think about the concept of free will, okay, especially in our society, the independency of free will is something we really rely upon in most of our, activities during the day. Even if you think about the legal aspect, the ethical aspect, we are free to make choices, and freedom is really an important part of our society. But what if this free will was just a misnomer, just a construct, and in the end it didn't make sense because you thought you were free, but in the end it's really your body making a decision for you, so it's just a layer. And this is something that would keep me awake at night if my son wouldn't do this already, because it's really, really important to understand that it has a straightforward impact in our ability of getting better. Let's say you have a patient that's suffering from depression, for instance. If the assumption is that there is such thing as free will, if you're doing a good job as a therapist, as a nurse, as a psychiatrist, now this person can incorporate some of those teachings, some of those skills, make it her own or his own, and then use it in the everyday life to change the way they think about life. For instance, working on cognitive distortion, these type of things. But if free will doesn't exist, it doesn't really matter what you're doing, because it's not really you that are doing it, it's your brain, and this other person's brain, it's already different, so you're kind of stuck there. You can say a lot of nice words that actually might work in the immediate outcome, but you're actually fooling yourself. This is not my point of view, obviously. I actually have a strong support of the existence of free will. And there are a lot of interesting research conducted on the neurological aspect of free will. So one of the main experiments simply tells that if free will existed, okay, if I am trying to stimulate your brain to have a specific action so that you can grab an item or you can respond to a test in a certain way, and you'll do that, then the assumption is that, well, I made you do it, me as a researcher, by stimulating your brain, okay? And if you just followed, that means that you didn't have a complete free will. On the other side, what's quite interesting, and this is covered in the book, and it's quite complex, so I will not discuss that in depth here. Whether you believe in free will or not will actually determine how fast you're going to be in your responses. Okay, which is kind of interesting. So, in other words, I'm not sure if free will exists or not, but if I believe it exists, then it will. If I don't believe it exists, it won't. Okay, and this is from a perspective of specific outcomes, right away. The last part of the context focuses on different areas, and those are only in alphabetical order, not in order of importance for sure. And I would like to focus on the last three, the traditional one, the Chinese medicine, the European medicine, Tibetan medicine, because they are representative of very, very different approaches, and it's something that's, again, cultural bound. Thank you. Just taking this mind, right? Projecting my own psychological process out. So, Chinese and Tibetan medicine share, I would say, a good percentage of common attitudes toward nature and to the natural healing power that the body has. But if you dig deeper, they're very much different. The same can be said about European medicine, which is sometimes used interchangeably for naturopathy or Heilkunde, or Neue Deutsche Heilkunde, which is the traditional folk medicine that was found, throughout Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. And again, everything here is an integrative approach to medicine, so the assumption again is that you can do something with your mind. Now, in the next slide here, we will focus on the research here. So what is this research about? What was I trying to investigate in this book? Well, we do have a focus group on the patient psychiatry unit, and the focus group is pretty much a patient satisfaction survey, and we just work on that newest edition, thanks to Vincent and others. So this is really important because we need to verify if you're doing a good job, also knowing that sometimes if you are actually doing a good job, that means that you will get bad reviews, because that's part of being in this field. So in this research, we attached a second part to the focus group, and the second part was actually this health perception survey, okay? And it was really focused on those elements that are not immediately measurable with the scientific method. So we're not measuring BMI, we're not measuring heart rate or oxygenation level. We're measuring qualitative data about patients. And most of the research should include quantitative approaches and qualitative approaches. Quantitative approaches pretty much focused on numbers and levels, okay? Qualitative approaches are to some extent the comparison between multiple choice and open questions in a quiz that you do in high school or in college. So I also want to stress here that our reliance on science should also be mindful of the fact that statements such as, well, you should trust the data because numbers don't lie, well, that is in itself quite controversial, because numbers don't lie because numbers don't tell the truth either. Numbers are just numbers, okay? So it's really our interpretation of the scientific data that really matters, whether it's in a statistical analysis type of spectrum, epidemiological type of spectrum, but there's no way you can take the human part outside of science, okay? That's a really fundamental element, okay? And the more we understand the process, the more we will actually embrace science, because we will not be afraid of science as something that will undermine our ethics, our morality, our sense of beliefs, or spirituality. We could embrace science fully because we are not going to be threatened by it. So those are the scales, rate your answer based on this Likert-like scale from absolutely disagree, absolutely agree, and I have to thank Luca Lassanti here for his guidance in that scale. Thank you. This is the first part of the survey. So factors that affect your health and how much you think your health depends on. And we came out with different descriptors here. So my health depends on destiny, medication, therapy, therapist and psychiatrist, randomness, external factors, yourself, brain chemistry, and genetic predisposition, okay? So we were trying to be as precise as possible, okay? And also defining the interaction, because the patient-provider interaction is quite important, okay? So we decided to separate therapy itself versus therapist and psychiatrist. But we like to change names on psychiatrists, so we used to be activity therapists, we're now group therapists, or roster psychotherapists. So in any case, something that we do often is to give a chance to patients to experience the same group multiple times. For instance, CBT is offered twice, they don't show 3. And so a person might be very much in tune with the content of the group, but might not be in tune with the therapist, because hypothetically speaking, the therapist has an accent, So we were trying to understand how much of the human elements was determining the results. That was the first part. There are two more parts. Part two is your view on life's purpose or meaning, okay? And how would you define life's meaning or purpose? So there is a meaning or purpose in life, and it can be discovered or known. There is a meaning or purpose in life, but it cannot be discovered or known. Life is randomness. Life depends on one's beliefs. Whether or not there is a purpose or meaning in life depends upon whether one gives it meaning or not. And life meaning depends entirely upon external factors such as environment, relationships, and social structure. Okay? Most of the patients wanted to leave the unit. We give this survey. What is it about? Psychotherapy or is it philosophy? But if you really think about, especially life depends upon one's own belief, and whether or not there's a purpose of meaning in life depends upon whether one gives it meaning or not. It's really fundamental if you're dealing with subjects or patients that are either suicidal in intent or at least they have a very negative self-talk. Because again, our job is to provide them with a strong core, not necessarily in a spiritual sense, because psychotherapy should work whether you're an atheist, agnostic, or spiritual or religious believer or not. But there's a lot of research that clearly indicates that the stronger your belief system, the better chances you have to feel better, especially after depression. Now, this is quite controversial, and I actually don't remember the exact number, it's in the book, but about 450, 460 studies were published in the last 6 years or so, okay? Not just in the United States, but in the world, trying to link this connection between system of beliefs and feeling better in terms of self-esteem and depression, okay? Now, this meta-analysis, this combination of studies did not really well define whether by system of belief we meant just religion or spirituality or any form of spiritual practice that put all in the same basket. But the results were pretty straightforward in the sense that the more people believed in something, such as a higher power, for instance, the less they re-experienced, feeling depressed again, or if they felt depressed again, they were, equipped with better tools to face this difficulty. With one big exception, however. In 2013, there was a study published in England that focused on many, many different countries, not just in Europe, that it asked exactly the same question, and this study appeared to disprove all this meta-analysis entirely. So what the study yielded in terms of results was the opposite. So the more you had a strong sense of belief, the less you were equipped to feel better of depression. So you were more depressed, and more, spiritual or religious. And again, you could argue that this is just one study versus 50 studies, a meta-analysis. However, you cannot just discard the study because it doesn't fit with your paradigm. That's not what science is about. It should actually give you the chance to better investigate why is that there is an outlier, okay? And once you account for all possible statistical errors and confirmation bias and other theoretical framework that might not actually be accurate, what would be the meaning behind the fact that the more religious someone is, the more chances this person will have to experience depression? Well, again, we need to separate causality, and the causal effects from just a plain correlation, okay, which this study did not investigate. So the only thing that was apparent in this study is that there were a lot of people that were spiritual or religious, okay, and the vast majority of these people were also very depressed. On the opposite, among all the people that had no specific beliefs, some of them were atheists, some agnostics, but did not have a framework of belief. Most of these people actually did not experience depression at all, or they felt better if they had depression previously. Now, this could mean two things. Either that religion or spirituality makes you depressed, and this might make sense in a sense that if you wanted to take that route, well, people that are religious or spiritual, they are, emotionally weak, and they need to have some sort of support, so they find that solace in religion because, they're not strong enough. But the opposite might be true as well. It's actually the fact that people that are depressed then become more religious because they feel that that's the only way they reconnect to their souls. Okay, so it can be both ways. Okay, so either your depression makes you more religious, or your religiosity or spirituality makes you more depressed. In any case, it really seems like that whether you like the first explanation or the second one, a discussion on something that goes beyond genetic transmitted information needs to happen, especially in the context of medicine, if you're trying to help a person, okay? Now, there's a lot of research now that clearly indicates the power of neuroplasticity, or in other ways, you know, the way the brain changes according to our own system of belief, okay? There's also a lot of pseudoscience out there, a lot of help books that are not really scientifically based, okay? So, I would be very, wary of certain, claims that if you really, really think hard about not feeling depressed, magically you will not be depressed again. So I will be very wary about that, okay? However, it's also true that you have a lot of power within yourself, okay? Whether you want to account yourself on a neurological level or not, you still have a lot of choice, and that's what we mean by free will. Moreover, more and more research clearly indicates that a lot of neurotransmitters are not just in the central nervous system, especially the brain, the pons medulla, and the spinal cord, but it's also in the digestive tract. So whenever someone is telling you, trust your gut, or you have a gut feeling, well, you should trust that. You should trust that. And aside from the fact that, women are much better than us men, because even neurologically speaking, their prefrontal cortex develops much faster, so they're pretty much all set by the age of 18 and a half. We're a little slower, but still, you can use all this connection, okay? So there must be something more, okay? Then the last part of this survey is actually your specific beliefs, and how much do you believe in life after death, how much you believe in God, how much do you believe in your ability to get better. And that was the last part, and it was a straightforward analysis here. So there's a lot of statistical analysis in the book. I just extrapolated a few images to show the results here. And again, this research was done in an inpatient psychiatry setting, so you could not infer that the results you find here can be applicable to the general population, okay? I was personally interested in seeing how I can relate as a therapist to the patient, so that I can be more welcoming, to this patient. The comparative means of all categories is a health perception survey, okay? And the second part is actually the focus group, the box plot analysis of all categories in the health perception survey with relative values, okay? So this is just a scatter plot in terms of answers, and I wanted to compare each of the results here from 0 to 10% and 0 to 80%, okay? And in the left side you have the answers to all the questions that we just discussed, and in the right side you have the question pertaining to the focus group, divided between MD, which are psychiatrists, AT, us, so the former activities therapists, then the residents, the social workers, and an MHT there. Okay, I don't have that. What did I do? Great. So, now, here is just an image of the focus group results, which is kind of interesting. So the first image here is a comparison between the total number, yeah, I know we're good, total number of the first most positive comments received by a provider, okay, and the total number of the second most positive comments received by a provider. So it looks like, and it's good because you're here, that nurses and group therapists in the unit are actually the best, the superstars on the unit. They receive the biggest amount of positive comments among all of us, so it's great. There is, if I remember, like a 5% or more positive comments for us psychotherapists, but that might be confirmation bias because we are the one administering the focus group. But in any case, I think that this is pretty telling how good nurses and and group therapists are on the unit. What was interesting though is the second part, that the biggest amount, the total number, the first most negative comments received by a provider were actually MDs and also nurses, and that was really interesting because, aside from the fact that I personally believe that everybody's doing a great job, nurses are actually, together with therapists, the people that on the unit spend the most amount of time with patients. and therefore they're more exposed to good comments and negative comments. And I feel that we should better understand where those comments come from, because first of all, we're interested in getting better reviews, because that means that we can establish a better rapport with them, but also therapeutically speaking, we can be more effective in our treatment. Okay, so that was quite interesting. Okay, also, the other thing that we should keep an eye on here is that we as group therapists do not prescribe or administer medication, nurses do. And that might actually account for the negative comments they received. In any case, that also depends on there. So now this is the second part, and again, I didn't copy the whole results. The first one is how much do you believe in life after death, okay? And the biggest results were between 7 and 8. Here, okay. And I decided to include that element because we are trying to be very open, tolerant, and mindful of different system of beliefs here. And life after death in itself, just as much as the existence of a separate and eternal soul, is not something that every religious tradition shares. Okay, so I wanted to have that as an example, so that I can do a better work if I'm doing, for instance, a one-on-one, conversation with a patient, being mindful of where I should start in terms of, assuming that they take for granted there is such thing as an afterlife after that or not. And the second one, how much do you believe in God? Okay, 8. It was, the vast majority of patients did believe in God. However, you have to be clear that this doesn't prove anything. It's simply a way to relate to what the patient's expectations are. Okay, so we are also lucky that on a unit we have a spiritual care department that takes care of that. So this is part of the conversation that we should have with our patients. Then other 3 statistical little circles here. Figure 15, life's meaning depends upon external factors. Okay, quite interesting. 8 is the biggest, so it depends a lot on external factors, or 1, it doesn't depend at all. And they're almost equally divided, which was very, very interesting. Okay. The central one, there is a meaning or purpose in life and it can be discovered or known. The vast majority believed it could, okay? Only 1% of the population did not believe that it was knowable, so to speak, okay? And this is really important regardless if the person is religious or not, because the assumption here is that eventually I have the chance to discover what the meaning is for me, okay? And this is really, really huge. Third, there is a meaning or purpose in life, but it cannot be discovered or known, okay? The biggest one is actually 5, which is almost halfway, okay? And it's interesting because you could say that if you frame the question a certain way, you will have a certain outcome. If you frame the sentence in a different way, you have a completely different outcome. So sometimes, since we cover a lot of cognitive distortions and the way our thought process influences the way we see others, including ourselves, this is actually pretty telling. The fact that you can, stimulate a type of response just by the way you phrase the sentence, okay? So, almost done. I'm really grateful for your attention here. So, figure 23, how much do you believe in your ability to get better? 8 is the biggest amount there, okay? And that's also very good. Now, unfortunately, one of the biggest challenges we might have is that a lot of patients might come from very difficult situation, social-cultural different situation, and a lot of patients are actually in the ED for a long time, so the emergency department. So when they come to our unit, most of the time they've already been there for a few days, and that's really impacts their general apprehension of what we do here. So a lot of people are actually happy when they get a unit because at least they believe that something can change. Okay? Figure 24, how much do you believe in life after death? Again, this was the same question, but included right after this, just to monitor if the thought process might change. And again, in this context, here we have the 8, the biggest amount, and 1, again, the second biggest amount. So the vast majority of people did believe there's a life after death, but a lot of people also believe that there's none. the next slide here is the amount of comments, okay? So this is the bar chart of the means of the total number of comments, okay, the blue one, okay, in the focus group survey compared to the total amounts of comments directly focused on patient-provider communication, green, and religious spiritual content. So this is the focus group, okay, so this has nothing to do with the research on the system of beliefs, but the two biggest categories were actually focused on the patient-provider relationship. This therapist treated me a certain way, this nurse treated me a certain way, had this type of conversation, followed by spiritual comments, okay? However, the spiritual comments are, very, very small in comparison to the patient-provider, which is quite indicative that once you establish a rapport with a person, then at that level you can dig deeper in those system of beliefs. And that is part of what we are trying to accomplish here. And the other one is just the comparison. The pie chart means the tonal or general comments, but directly focus on patient-provider communication, and comments with religious spiritual content. And you see that the communication is really, really key. So thank you for this attention. You give it to the research. This book is really an attempt to start a conversation about what really is important in life. And there are a lot of areas that are not clear to professionals as well. We should be careful not to fall, prey of the God of the gaps argument. If you're not familiar with the God of the gaps argument, is if something's not explicable, it's not clear, that must be a higher power, must be God. It's really not a good approach in science. It's a cop-out mechanism, okay? However, at the same time, thinking that just because you can observe things in a statistical analysis, you can claim to know everything about a person, that is also not really good practice, okay? And there's a lot of analysis in the textbook here, it's not really a textbook, but on the influence of medications as well. And this is another big conversation that we should have. On one side, understanding that there's really no magic pill that could solve anybody's problem, but at the same time, we should also be wary of the fact that discounting everything on the assumption that big pharma is just out there to harm us, it's also quite conspiratorial in tones. And if you need to help people, you should try to listen to them at their need and meet them where they are. And this is applicable to any type of conversation, whether you're talking about vaccination, whether you're talking about natural methods as opposed to chemically based methods. You need to understand the person. And again, the concept here is you're not trying just to be nice to the person. You're being more open with your mind and your heart to the person really means that you're going to do a better job. Because even in that case, there's always a little percentage of placebo and nocebo effect. Placebo effect being the positive outcomes depending on your own system of belief. So if you believe that this therapy, this medication will work, it will actually work. And the nocebo is actually the opposite. If you don't believe it will work, then your beneficial outcomes will not be as high. Now, I will stop here for now because I would like to leave a little room for your questions and some conversations as we talk about communication, half of the presentation, and I should practice what I preach. So thank you for now, and before I finish, I just want to read the main responsible people for this book, which are the people that made this book possible. So I would like to start with my family out there, my wife Lydia, and my children Lucas and Adrian, my in-laws, Buzzo is here, and my family in Italy, in former Yugoslavia, and here in the United States. And then all the universities, the UVM Medical Center, and really all the group therapists. And I want to mention all their names because that'd be wonderful. And since this research started in 2014, some of the people are not there with us anymore, but in any case, so Carl Clausen, John Dervan, Lindsay Enman, Sherry Gates, Kevin Mello, Annie Rappaport, Emily Rhymes, Joshua Shapstar, Doria Tudor, and Alexandra West. Without their precious help, this research would never have been possible. So thank you very much. any chat conversation will not psychoanalyze anybody. Were you first?
Who's the book written for, and is it applicable to therapy, or what?
Yes, I mean, it is not a therapeutic book per se, okay, it's more a philosophical book in that sense, but it's really part of what I believe to be most important, in the sense that the first sentence in the book is actually, philosophy is the mother of all sciences, and the last sentence of the book is something like, most of the results that are not printed in paper are discarded. And this is really my attitude about things. The first one is simply because whatever you do science, you're doing philosophy. And it's not just to embellish terms, but because your outlook in life and your perspective changes what you're doing. And that's why I prefer to study on one side neuroscience, because of the hardcore evidence that we all share the brain, and on the other side, the way you feel about yourself. So there is some inputs of therapeutic level here, some advice on what to do about your life, but it's not therapeutic per se. Yes?
So, I think about science and living in a culture where science has quite a bit of preeminence.
Mm-hmm.
And so science really defines its terms very carefully as to, it studies what is external and verifiable and repeatable.
Yes.
And so my rich inner world is entirely private, unless I bring it out in a questionnaire, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And that reveals just a small amount of who I am and so on. So this inner world that I've got is like secondary in the world around me. It's not given the same kind of recognition. There is no STEM courses for brains in the world.
Yeah.
All right, there's none of that. And so I think that a lot of people have a great deal of difficulty sensing their own personal animation, sensing their own feelings in their body, understandings in their thoughts, recognizing that they are an energy form, an existence, a set of processes, a set of experiences, and being fully in their animation. And so as I work with these psychiatric patients that we work with, when they tell me I am bipolar, my favorite thing to say in response is, you are not a diagnosis. And that shifts that emphasis from a scientific interpretation to the question of who am I? And so once you start that question of who am I, and maybe the question of, well, I do live in my own reactivity in life. I have all these processes going on. So I have a limited amount of control, but I step back and say, am I happy with my reactions? And then I can have a conversation.
Great doing, yes, I couldn't have said it better. It's a slippery slope when you talk about those things in general, because unfortunately we live in a very polarized world, and unfortunately sometimes you really toss the baby with the dirty water when you talk about your sense of self. But I could not agree more. You're not a diagnosis, absolutely. In fact, the general pattern that seems to be apparent is that even in psychiatry, most of diagnoses are switching from being a kind of written in stone definition to being on a spectrum. That's one of the things that we notice here, and I can tell you, it's the way someone behaves always compared with someone else's behavior. So who are we to say that the behavior is more socially acceptable is the majority of the behavior, as opposed to the outlier. So I will say that. And the other thing is, I try to start from what we share, and that's why I'm using the brain as an example, because it's simply something we all share. So race and ethnicity and even religion can be viewed as social construct, but we all share the brain. However, and I'm very clear here, I don't mention that too much in psychotherapy. I would be nothing really without my own system of beliefs. I don't share that much with my patient because, first of all, our role is not to educate or preach in that sense, and it's really beyond our job. But the brain in itself cannot tell you how you should go about life. The brain's a wonderful machine, probably the most complex and fantastic machine, but it's not the brain job to, evaluate morality. Even if there is a lot of research that clearly indicates that the way we perceive morality is actually a neurological aspect. It's just a manifestation, extreme manifestation. The best metaphor I could use is the brain as a radio transmitter or something. So, nobody would claim that if you have, or a computer, you would not claim that the computer, in this case, generated content. However, we also need to understand that this content is not just computation, because it's 2017, so computers are much, much better than us already in doing computation. But if you look at the process, the brain is fantastic. It's not everything there is. Plus, there are other brains that are evaluating diagnosis and other patients, so you could say that's part of the same cycle. A lot of diagnoses, especially in psychiatry, are still based on symptomatology, so just our own perception, and even in neuroscience, as much as I'm a very big fan of neuroscience, it's also true that a lot of neuroscience is really very nice, executed, very nice colored, fMRI pictures, but the content itself, it's not really there in a sense. I can tell you right away if you're actually pondering whether to eat something or to, to see something, but I cannot tell you what you're viewing or what you're tasting. So already at that level, I'm unable to understand where you come from unless I have a communication with you. So I fully support everything you just said. Yes?
I think patients are demanding this kind of hybridization.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to sit and let us just make these statements and assumptions. And so, if this kind of research can lead us to being more facile on a continuum to help meet people where they're at, I just think that it's terrific to see this. It's been a long time coming. I've been around a long time. So
You have an expertise in that field too.
So it's like it's wonderful to see the data that can support the things that even you're saying.
In psychology and even in neuroscience, really, things like emotional intelligence, that it just makes sense. And aside from the psychotherapeutic element that you need to be connected to your emotions when you're grieving, for instance, this all defining separation between the right and left hemisphere is completely independent, and one is the mathematical area and the other one is the visual creative part. Although this general definition still holds true, even when you're evaluating how to solve an equation, your emotional part is active. There's a lot of research, if you're interested, by Låg Tomasi, a Portuguese neuroscientist in that field. So again, it's a misnomer that you can just discard your emotion, because emotions are not a simpler or more naive way to look at the world. There are shortcuts in that sense, because emotions are also, from the perspective of evolution and biology, those elements that allow us to understand where there was a threat before we had a conversation. We evaluate this person was actually threatening to us. We already know that. Facial expression, one of those things that tend to be universal, at least 6 or 7 of them. But that's actually the core we're trying to do here. So, thank you. Yes.
So I missed the first part, so I don't exactly know what your
it's boring
background is
anyway.
or whatever. But I'm thinking one of the things that I've noticed in the scientific world of my personal interest is neurodevelopmental disorders.
Yeah.
And we don't really. There's been a lot of focus in research on sort of group models of how to answer questions, and in some ways they work well, but sometimes I think we don't know what questions to ask from that methodology. And then there's the clinical side, which usually focuses on individuals. And in some disciplines, we do that better than others. In psychotherapy, some people focus on a fairly advanced model of an individual because you have 100 sessions with someone, for example, potentially.
Yes.
If you really do long psychotherapy. But, I've wondered about, maybe sort of an understanding of process in the field and how we might move as a field to more more scientifically investigate a whole person and sort of function as a system versus as a unit of a question, if you know. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely understand, and yeah, it's great you pointed this out, because I always like to say that every psychological disorder is a social disorder, in a sense that sure, there are specific elements that are evidenced by neurobiology, especially genetically transmitted traits such as schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder. However, everything is situated, everything is socialized, everything is contextualized. So if there's a person who has a developmental problem on a psychological level, then trying to extrapolate the problem from the social familial area is actually not doing a good job, even scientifically speaking. In another case, a person is depressed for a lot of different factors. So while it's true that you can have a very good upbringing, a good childhood, a good moral guidance, a lot of friends, money, etc., and still get depressed, so it's not just that. It's also true that if you're a very upbeat person, but you don't sleep at night, you work in a very toxic environment, you tend to isolate, you don't have a system of support, then you will experience some depression. So that's what I'm saying. Psychiatric issues are also social issues. We live in an environment, we are social beings, and claiming that this is not true, it's really not following current scientific evaluation. Now, I like to go back and forth between extremes, because in science there are a lot of people that claim to have invented a new way to look at things. And again, in this book I cannot claim to have invented anything. I'm just representing a combination of research, okay? And it's not just because of scientific honesty, but because most of the time what happens is that you have outliers. Sometimes very good scientists discover a new way to look at things, but then if you go all the way to that perspective, the whole paradigm shift doesn't take into account what has been discovered at that point. So you have people that believe everything is biology, everything is genetics, there's no such thing as influence of family. There are people on the opposite side, genes don't really matter. And the more, and again I cannot claim to be a Nobel-Preis or anything, but the more I'm reading research, it seems to be both. And you have nature and you have nurture. While it is true that some of the discussion and even ethical guidance been with us, since millennia, that are the core part of every religion, pretty much, like the golden rule. Pharmacological intervention is quite recent. So on one side, we have a lot of information from what seems to work up to this point, in terms of what things we should tell to each other to make us feel better, to be nurturing, be lovable, be mindful, be tolerant. We don't have as much research based on neurotransmitters, but we are starting. So my, again, gut feeling is that we're actually closing the circle here. So we're trying to understand better, coming from two opposite directions. One is the genetic part, and one is the social, the spiritual part, and we will eventually meet in the middle. That's what I see. Yes?
I have this question, and I'm not sure if it's going to come out correctly, but in your research, have you found, I'm really interested in the concept of free will.
Yes?
Some correlation between persons that, in terms of integration with a certain cognitive disorder or cognitive impairment, and their ability to discern that from the concept of free will. Do you find that their success is higher the less they define themselves or align themselves with certain disorder in terms of getting through certain issues versus being really deep into belief that this is who I am, like the gentleman said before, identifying with it and being successful in terms of I have capacity to change this, or I depend on somebody else to help me change this?
Thank you. Yes, that's a very good and complex question. I'll try to answer to the best of my ability. This comes up quite often when I'm working with the ethics department at UVM, and it's the central question of the the preservation of self. Like, for instance, when you have a different state of consciousness on the biological level, whether you're in a comatose state, you're in a locked-in syndrome, etc., where you can respond only to some extent. Where do we define the cessation of self? Okay, we can agree on physical death, brain death, or cardiovascular death, the heart stop beating. But with the self, it's quite complex. And again, the research that I mentioned at the beginning of, thank you, that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk about how important it is to be mindful of how much we can actually decide really has a positive outcome. At the same time, though, there are a lot of times in which we have to make a very complex decision, and one of the ways to do that is to have advanced directives, to ask a person in advance what they would like to do in terms of the way they would like to live this world, for instance, death, for instance. The other part we have, the capacity issue, which also determines, whether, medication is indicated to be mandatory, so to speak, and that person is, involuntary, etc. Sometimes our biggest fear is that if we assume that the neurons will define ourselves, then if our brain starts to act out, we lose ourselves and we might lose our soul. Okay. In fact, there is actually quite a bit of literature, from classical, Dennett, Richard Dawkins, etc., that covers that aspect. Sorry, your soul just died because there are nothing but neurotransmitters. So that fear, it's a rational fear, in a sense that that's what part of the research seems to go to. Okay, it's not enough though. It's not enough, in my opinion. I'll say that as an opinion. And disclaimer: I'm Italian, so I'm Catholic, but we don't burn witches anymore. I promise. I can't escape that. I was born there. The Vatican is right there. So, so obviously, there are some things that every religion shares in terms of the expectation of something more than just this plane of reality. Okay, in that sense. I don't often mention that because it's a double-edged sword, especially if you deal, with patients that might have suffered, pedophilia, etc. But on the other side, I cannot honestly claim to be able to define yourself, because even if you remove all those constructs, social constructs and biological constructs, the subjective experience is still subjective. So I cannot honestly claim to know how it feels to be you. However, on the other side, if I can still attempt to convey some information based on cognitive and computational level. If you do, a cognitive assessment, a MOCA, for instance, at Montreal Cognitive Assessment, you can understand what this person is in. So on the other side, claiming that a self is constant, it's really not true in scientific terms. Buddhism told us, since millennia, that the self always changes. But for instance, if my grandma, I used to have Alzheimer's, claiming that the self will not be impacted by neurology, it's actually a misnomer. So expecting the same reaction from my grandmother, when she got Alzheimer's before, is not actually doing a service. I still believe she had a soul, but that's my personal opinion that I'm trying not to, pour into science in that sense. So no, I didn't really answer your question. Yes.
So you're talking about, so you personally do have a belief in spirituality and a soul and some level of sort of traditional Christian theology as well. How do you, on a very sort of, physical level, do you have some belief in terms of where the science might go in terms of what that means on a neuroscientific level? Like, in the philosophy of mind field, there's, some different ideas about them. I'm just curious where you...
I tend to be a very hopeful person. I try to be positive, but again, I have a good supportive environment board, so that helps, So I love science, and I think science will progress, and so we'll have more chances to better understand who we are. You know, I was always very, you know, I consider myself a religious person, but I'm also very skeptical in that sense. So I feel science is the language that we can use to mutually understand one another without, you know, the risk of being, you know, offended, and without being prone to judge without really knowing things. And in fact, to be fair, I kind of did this experiment for a few years. I tried to be a full-blown atheist because I just want to know how it really feels, not in terms of cognition, but and I read whatever I could find about, you know, scientific atheism, and honestly with you, a lot of things make a lot of sense to me. It's still not enough sense for me to remove my system of belief at this point, but it's part of the conversation we should have. So I don't think, I mean, science is not religious, nor should it be in that sense. We should keep those realms completely separate, if you ask me. However, whether, in other words, if you use science and a scientific method to prove or disprove the existence of God, you know, I don't think you're going to get much information in that sense, because you're just using a different and non-applicable methodology. But when it comes to understanding who we are as human beings and how the world works, I think science is the primary way to go about that, and I think we're in a very fertile time. So I'm very, very hopeful about science in every field. But again, science is not a thing, it's not a person. Okay, so science is made up by scientists, and maybe this is the last thing I'm going to mention before you all fall asleep. Okay, so science, contrary to spirituality and religion, changes and needs to change. Science improves by trial and error. Okay, so expecting science to be dogmatic, it's really wrong, because, you know, you need to discard all your research the moment you find a better research, a better way to explain things. Period. Spiritual religion is actually the opposite. You know, what you're not evaluating what will come next. You're not so much interested in the new. You're interested in those things that never change, and those things that are kind of absolute in that sense. But that's the slippery slope. You don't, you know, I personally have this aversion for, you know, authoritative approaches and dogmatism in general. You know, so I'm a little concerned about certain extremes, but those extremes can be found in science as well. You know, when I talk about monistic, materialistic, nihilistic science, sorry, your soul just died. In fact, your soul never existed. You know, I feel there's enough, you know, extremist views in that area as well, but we need them to balance. Well, thank you for, you know, being so patient and, you know,